I have worked Presidio County long enough to know the desert has a personality. It isn't empty. It isn't quiet. It watches. 3,800 square miles of dust and stone, spread thin over barely 7,000 souls. Out here, distance swallows sound, and help is always farther away than you think. In the summer of 2018, the heat stopped being just weather. It became pressure. By noon, the air shimmered like liquid, climbing past 115 degrees, warping the horizon and baking the radios until they hissed with static. Engines overheated. Men lost their tempers for no reason. Dogs refused to leave the shade. Even the wind felt exhausted. I'd seen heat kill people before, slow and polite, like it was doing them a favor. But that summer felt different. Nights didn't cool off. The stars looked sharper somehow. Closer, as if the sky itself were leaning in to listen. I remember waking up soaked in sweat, convinced someone had been standing in my bedroom, just out of sight. Folks around town started saying the same thing in different ways. Sleeplessness, headaches, a sense of being watched from the open land beyond their porch lights. The desert wasn't just enduring the heat, it was holding on to it, storing it. Like a memory it didn't want to let go. People who move here think the desert is just land without people on it. I stopped correcting them years ago. The truth makes them uncomfortable. The desert isn't dead space, it's a witness. Every step you take out here stays longer than it should. Tracks last weeks, bones bleach white and never quite disappear. I learned early that the desert keeps a record, not in writing, but in absence. When something goes missing, the land notices. When something dies, it doesn't rush to hide it. I've always believed places shape behavior. In cities, noise covers mistakes. Out here, silence forces you to sit with them. That's why lies feel heavier in Presidio County. You can drive for hours with nothing but your own thoughts and the sound of tires on cracked asphalt. Eventually, the truth catches up. The desert strips people down. It takes away distractions, comforts, excuses. What's left is who you really are when no one is watching, except the land itself. That's why I respected it, feared it. 2, I followed its rules. Carry extra water. Don't travel at night unless you must. Never ignore the feeling that tells you to turn back. Most folks think superstition starts where logic ends. I learned the opposite. Superstition is just logic that survived something terrible. And the desert? It has survived everything. That's why, when it starts acting strange, you don't argue. You listen. The call came just after sunrise, when the heat was already climbing and the radios hadn't stopped crackling from the night before. Bobby Hernandez was not a man who wasted words. He'd run cattle on 10,000 acres since he was a teenager, survived droughts, floods, and border violence without ever dialing my number twice. When his name lit up the screen, I knew something had gone wrong. When I answered, he didn't say hello. He said my name like a warning. His voice shook. Not fear exactly, confusion edged with anger. He told me his cattle had locked up near the north rise, bunched tight, lowing like they were cornered. They wouldn't move forward, wouldn't scatter, just stared at the ground like it offended them. Bobby said animals know things before we do. He said the land felt wrong. Then he went quiet for a second too long, breathing hard, before telling me there was something new out there, something that hadn't been there last week. I asked him what he meant. He said, "Sheriff, I need you to come see this yourself," and hung up before I could tell him help was on the way. Bobby was waiting at the gate when we arrived, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the open land beyond the fence. The cattle stood in a tight knot near the base of the north rise, Hundreds of pounds of muscle pressed together like they were trying to merge into a single body. I'd never seen herd behavior like that. When Bobby whistled and waved his arms, they only shifted backward, hooves scraping dirt, panic rippling through them in low, restless moans. One calf broke free and bolted, then skidded to a stop as if it had hit an invisible wall, bawling until its mother dragged it back by force. The heat was brutal, but this wasn't heat stress. Animals will push through thirst and exhaustion if instinct tells them it's safe. Here, instinct was screaming the opposite. I walked ahead of the group, boots crunching over dry soil, and felt it myself, a pressure in my chest, subtle but unmistakable, like standing too close to heavy machinery. The air smelled wrong, sharp and mineral, and the flies refused to cross the same line the cattle wouldn't. Bobby muttered a prayer under his breath. When I reached the crest of the rise, I understood why nothing living wanted to go any farther. From the top of the rise, the land dipped into a shallow bowl, too clean to be natural. Sunlight should have bounced off the surface, but instead it vanished, swallowed whole by a circle of black that looked more like an absence than an object. The glass was perfectly smooth, unbroken, as if the earth itself had melted and decided to stay that way. No cracks, no bubbles, no edges, just a flawless disk pressed into the dirt. The heat above it felt sharper, focused, like the air was being bent downward. I stepped closer and felt my ears pop, the way they do at sudden altitude. My reflection never appeared. The glass didn't mirror the sky, the clouds, or my face. It only drank them in. Symbols were cut into its surface, precise and deep, arranged in patterns that made my eyes slide away if I stared too long. I couldn't tell where the carving began or ended. Each mark seemed to lead into the next, forming something that felt intentional, purposeful, and deeply wrong. Behind me, Bobby refused to come closer. He stood at the edge of the rise, whispering that the land had never looked like this. He said storms left scars. Fires left scars. But this was different. This looked deliberate. Standing there, with the desert silent and the glass breathing in the light, I realized we weren't looking at damage. We were looking at something that had been placed, patiently and with care. I didn't see the bodies at first. The glass held my attention too completely, like it was daring me to lean closer. Then my eyes adjusted, and the pattern revealed itself. 7 shapes lay embedded within the circle, arranged with deliberate symmetry. They were positioned like the points of a star, feet meeting neatly at the center, arms slack, heads tilted back toward the empty sky. The precision of it made my stomach tighten. Nothing about this was accidental. They were mummified by heat and time, skin drawn tight over bone, clothing reduced to stiff, colorless robes that crumbled at the edges. Their mouths were frozen open, stretched wide in expressions that were not quite pain and not quite fear, as if they had seen something just before death that stole language from them. I forced myself to look at their faces, and that's when my breath caught. Their eyes were gone. In their sockets sat the same black glass, smooth and seamless, fused to bone. It overflowed slightly, hardened where it had spilled down their cheeks. I imagined it poured while they were still alive, and had to look away. The desert was silent behind me. No wind, no insects. 7 bodies, arranged like an offering, resting in a circle that drank the light, waiting for something I couldn't yet name. The first autopsy report landed on my desk 2 days later, and I read it 3 times before it made any sense at all. According to Dr. Sarah Chen, the bodies were not recent. Tissue degradation, bone density, and desiccation patterns all pointed to deaths that occurred decades ago, 20 years at the minimum, possibly closer to 30. That alone should have ended the conversation. Bobby's land hadn't been disturbed in years. The glass circle hadn't existed a week earlier. Yet the bodies were old enough to belong to another generation entirely. It got worse. The black glass in their eye sockets showed advanced weathering. Micro-pitting, consistent with long-term exposure to wind and sand. The symbols carved into the surface matched that same timeline. Whatever tools had been used to cut them would have needed extreme precision and heat, the kind you don't find in a desert pasture in the late 80s. Dr. Chen underlined her conclusion twice. The evidence contradicted the scene itself. When I called her, she lowered her voice. She said the bodies were old, but the placement was recent, as if something had taken remains from the past and carefully arranged them in the present. I stared at the report, feeling the gap between logic and reality widen, and understood that the case wasn't broken. Time was. I went back to the site with fresh eyes, camera in hand, forcing myself to look past the bodies and focus on the markings cut into the glass. Up close. The symbols were worse. They weren't decorative or random. Each line had depth and direction, intersecting at angles that made my vision blur if I followed them too long. The edges were rounded, softened by years of erosion, as if wind and sand had been worrying at them for decades. You don't get that kind of wear overnight. You earn it with time. Lab analysis confirmed what my instincts already knew. The carvings showed micro-fractures consistent with long-term exposure. The same kind you see on old headstones or abandoned mining equipment left out in the open. Yet the glass itself showed no signs of having been moved or reworked. It was as if it had always been there, quietly aging in place, waiting to be noticed again. What bothered me most was that the symbols didn't repeat. There was no pattern I could reduce to language, no alphabet to decode. They felt more like instructions than words, something meant to be followed rather than read. Standing over that circle, watching the light vanish into it, I had the uneasy sense that the weathering wasn't just from age, it was from use. We found the footprint just beyond the edge of the glass, pressed deep into the hard-packed soil, as if the ground had briefly softened to accept it. It was too long to be human, nearly twice the length of my boot, and too narrow to belong to any animal native to the county. 3 toes ended in blunt, claw-like impressions that dug forward, suggesting weight and forward motion, not a pause. I knelt beside it and felt a chill despite the heat. Whatever left that mark had stood there deliberately. The depth was wrong. Soil that dry shouldn't give that much, not without heavy machinery or recent rain. And we'd had neither. I measured it twice. The pressure implied several hundred pounds, maybe more, balanced on a frame built for walking, not crawling. There were no drag marks, no sign of hesitation, just one clear step, perfectly placed, facing the center of the circle like it had been observing its work. The strangest part was the absence of others. No approach, no departure. One footprint, and then nothing, as if the rest of it had never touched the ground at all. I stood up slowly, aware of the empty land around us, and realized the desert hadn't recorded a path, only a presence. We established the perimeter before nightfall, stretching tape and floodlights around the rise, like it might convince whatever was out there to stay put. 2 deputies on rotation, radios checked every 30 minutes, eyes on the circle at all times. Officially, it was evidence control. Unofficially, no one wanted to be alone with that thing after dark. The desert cooled only slightly, heat bleeding off the rocks in slow waves that made the shadows ripple. Insects stayed away. Even the usual night sounds felt muted, like the land was holding its breath. I took first watch with Deputy Martinez. He tried to joke, said at least the view was nice. His laugh died quickly. The glass circle swallowed the floodlights just like it swallowed the sun. Edges barely visible unless you knew where to look. Staring at it too long made my head ache, a dull pressure behind the eyes. Radios popped with bursts of static that didn't match any frequency. Every time Martinez adjusted the dial, the static seemed to adjust back. Around midnight, the wind shifted and carried a faint smell of burned metal. Martinez asked if I smelled it too. Before I could answer, the pressure in my ears spiked, sharp and sudden. I remember thinking that the perimeter felt less like a boundary and more like an invitation, drawn around something that was patiently waiting for us to get tired. Martinez took the late watch alone. I was back at the station, halfway through bad coffee, when the radio cracked to life at 3:17 a.m. His call sign came through first, stretched thin by static. I answered immediately. For a second, there was only breathing. Fast, shallow, too close to the mic. Then he said my name. Not Sheriff. My name. Like he needed to be sure it was really me. He told me something was moving near the circle. Not approaching. Not leaving. Just shifting. Like the air itself had learned how to stand up. I asked for clarification. He didn't respond right away. When he spoke again, his voice sounded wrong, flattened, like he was talking through water. He said the glass was warm. He said the shadows didn't match the lights anymore. I heard footsteps over the open channel. Slow. Heavy. Martinez whispered that he could hear someone breathing behind him. But when he turned, there was nothing there. The static grew louder, pulsing in rhythm with his words. Then he said, very calmly, "Sheriff, it knows I'm here." I told him to get back in the car. I told him we were on our way. His last sound wasn't a scream. It was a sharp exhale, like something had surprised him. Then the radio went dead, leaving only the hiss of an open line that refused to close. We reached the site in under 20 minutes, lights cutting through the dark as hard as they could. But the desert didn't give anything back. Martinez's patrol car sat where he'd left it, driver's door open, engine still running. The radio inside was screaming with static. No blood, no signs of a struggle. His flashlight lay on the ground, still on. Beam fixed on the glass circle. That's when I saw it had changed. The pattern inside the circle was complete now. 8 bodies, not 7. Martinez lay among them, placed with the same care as the others, feet drawn neatly into the center point of the star. His uniform was intact, barely dusty, as if he'd been laid down gently. I dropped to my knees beside the glass and felt heat radiating from it in sharp pulses. His face was peaceful. That was the worst part, where his eyes should have been. Black glass had set perfectly into the sockets, still warm, still soft enough at the edges to show it hadn't fully cooled. I reached out before I could stop myself and burned my fingers. There was no smell of fire, no scorch marks, no explanation for how something that hot had been made in total silence. 8 bodies, 1 added in minutes. I understood then that the circle wasn't finished, and that Martinez hadn't been taken. He had been accepted. I went back at first light, before the FBI sealed the area, and before anyone could tell me not to. The desert looked innocent in the morning, pale and quiet, like it was pretending nothing had happened. Martinez's absence felt heavier than his body ever had. I started where the footprint had been, and found more of them waiting. Faint but undeniable, pressed into the dirt, like the land had reluctantly agreed to remember. They led away from the circle in a straight, confident line, never hesitating, never overlapping. The tracks didn't behave like real tracks. Some were deep, others barely kissed the surface, as if the thing making them couldn't quite decide how much of itself belonged in our world. Every few yards. They simply stopped, then resumed several feet ahead, with no disturbance in between, no scuffing, no broken brush. It was like following edits in a film where whole seconds had been cut out. The farther I went, the more wrong the terrain felt. Familiar landmarks didn't line up the way they should have. My compass drifted, needle trembling instead of settling. I realized I was walking toward a part of the county I'd patrolled for decades, yet something about the path told me I was trespassing somewhere new. When the tracks ended at a dark opening in the rock, I knew I'd followed them exactly where I was meant to. The cave swallowed sound the moment I stepped inside. My flashlight beam caught on walls that looked melted, stone sagging and frozen mid-drip. Symbols burned into it so deep they cast their own shadows. The air smelled old, wax, dust, something coppery underneath. I found the journals stacked carefully on a flat rock, protected from the elements like someone expected them to be read. The covers were cracked, pages brittle, handwriting changing over the years, but the message staying the same. They spoke of preparation, of patience, of thinning a boundary that most people never feel, but everyone crosses eventually. Dates ran back more than 30 years, entries written by different hands that all described the same dreams, the same star patterns, the same circle of glass. Sketches filled the margins, 7 figures arranged with mathematical precision. Notes about timing, alignment, willingness. This wasn't madness. It was planning. Near the back, the tone shifted. Urgent, reverent. Names appeared in lists, some crossed out, some underlined. I recognized a few from old missing persons files. Then I saw Martinez's name, circled in red ink that looked too fresh to belong in a decades-old book. The final entry was short, almost celebratory. It said the door was ready, the 7 were placed, and that the 8th had come exactly as promised. The 9th, it claimed, would make it permanent. The last journal lay apart from the others, wrapped in oilcloth like something fragile or sacred. Its pages were newer, the paper less yellowed, but the handwriting trembled, as if the person who wrote it had begun to understand the cost. I sat on the cave floor and read it slowly, feeling the weight of every word. The writer no longer sounded hopeful. They sounded relieved, as if the long wait was finally over. The entry described the ritual not as a summoning, but as a correction, a realignment. It said the glass was not a symbol, but a threshold, and the bodies were not sacrifices, but keys. 7 to weaken the barrier, 8 to stabilize it, the 9th to open it fully. The language was clinical, almost gentle, like instructions for a medical procedure. No mention of blood, no mention of pain, just necessity. At the bottom of the page, a date was written and rewritten until the ink bled through. Beneath it was a single sentence, underlined so hard the paper nearly tore. It is already here. It has always been here. We are only teaching it where to step. I closed the journal and realized the cave felt smaller than when I'd entered, as if something unseen had leaned closer to read over my shoulder. I heard him before I saw him. Slow footsteps echoing where there shouldn't have been any, measured and familiar enough to make my chest tighten. I called out, expecting no answer, and almost dropped my light when Martinez stepped into the beam. He was whole, uniform clean, face unmarked, for a heartbeat. My mind tried to accept it, tried to rewrite what I'd already seen. Then he smiled, and I understood something was wrong. The smile didn't reach his eyes. They were too still, too empty, like glass waiting to be poured. He moved with a hesitation that reminded me of a poorly dubbed film. each gesture following the last with a fraction of delay. When he spoke, his voice came out layered, his own tone buried beneath something deeper and older. He said my name again, softly, the way he had over the radio. I asked him how he was standing there. He tilted his head, considering the question like it was new. He said the body was a useful shape, that it remembered how to walk. I raised my weapon, hands shaking, and he didn't react. He just took a step closer, boots scraping stone, and told me not to be afraid, that what wore him had been waiting a very long time to speak to someone who would listen. Martinez stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could smell the desert on him, hot dust and burned metal. When he spoke again, it wasn't just his voice anymore. Words overlapped, slipping out of sync, as if several mouths were sharing the same throat. He said we instead of I, and I felt the temperature in the cave drop despite the heat outside. The walls seemed to lean in, eager. They told me they were the servants, not born but assigned, that they moved between moments the way we move between rooms. The desert, they said, was thin here, worn down by time and repetition. Every ritual, every disappearance, every story whispered and forgotten had weakened it further. The glass circle wasn't an altar, it was a hinge. I demanded to know what they wanted with Martinez. The thing wearing him laughed softly and said the question was backward. Martinez had wanted them. He had been chosen because he listened, because he stood watch, because he was already halfway between worlds when the call came. The servants didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. They said the pattern was almost complete, and that resistance only ensured my place in the story. As they spoke, I realized with quiet horror that nothing in their tone suggested urgency, only patience. When I fired, the sound cracked through the cave like a dropped plate, sharp and final. The first round hit Martinez square in the chest. He didn't flinch. The second took him in the shoulder, spinning him just enough to prove the body still obeyed physics. On the third shot, something burst from the wound, not blood, not smoke, but a spray of liquid black glass that splashed against the rock and cooled instantly. It hardened where it landed, veins of obsidian crawling outward like frost. I kept firing until the magazine clicked empty. Each impact tore open flesh that should have bled red, but only more molten glass spilled out, hissing softly as it met the air. The smell was unbearable. Burned minerals, ozone, something ancient cracking open. Martinez staggered, movements jerky now, like the strings had tangled. He looked down at himself with mild curiosity, as if this outcome had always been expected. He met my eyes one last time, for a moment. I thought I saw fear there. Then the servant spoke again, voice breaking apart as the body failed. They told me this changed nothing, that the pattern accounted for interruption, that I was already too close to step away clean. Martinez collapsed, the body emptying itself into glass and silence. When it was over, the cave floor was littered with black shards, cooling and lifeless, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. By the time the FBI arrived in force, the desert had erased its fingerprints. The cave was still there, but everything inside it was wrong by absence. No journals, no candles, no bones stacked with care. The walls were bare stone again, unmarked and ordinary, as if heat and time had never touched them. Even the melted rock I'd leaned against was solid now, cool and unremarkable. It felt like standing in a room after someone had finished cleaning up a crime that never officially happened. They searched for hours, ground-penetrating radar, chemical tests. Nothing. The black glass shards I'd seen spill from Martinez's body were gone, leaving only dust and my testimony. Agent Foster didn't accuse me of lying, which was worse. She listened, nodding slowly, eyes distant, like she was comparing my words to something she already knew. When I insisted there had been evidence, physical, undeniable, she said the desert was very good at keeping secrets when it wanted to. The final blow came at the morgue. Martinez's body, tagged and sealed the night before, was missing. No forced entry, no broken locks. In its place, carved deep into the steel examination table, were words so precise they looked machined. "The 9th is chosen." I stared at them until the letters blurred, realizing the evidence hadn't vanished. It had moved on. Agent Foster laid the dates out in a way that made my stomach sink. The original 7 victims had vanished on the same day. Different years. Same hour, June 21st. Summer solstice. The longest day. The point where the sun lingers before it begins to retreat. It wasn't symbolism. It was scheduling. The desert had been used like a calendar. Each death a mark carved into time itself. We pulled old files. Missing persons reports that had never quite fit. Hikers, ranch hands, drifters, people who knew the land well enough to trust it. When we overlaid their disappearances with astronomical data, the pattern tightened. Solstices, rare alignments, nights when the stars formed the same geometry sketched in the cave journals. 7 points. Then 8. Always leading forward. The message carved into the autopsy table mentioned 3 days. Foster circled the date in red. June 12th. I knew it before she said it out loud. That was the anniversary of the Presidio County massacre of 1887, a night no one here liked to talk about, when an entire settlement vanished without bodies or witnesses. The pattern wasn't random, and it wasn't new. It was repeating, refining itself over generations, and whatever had been started back then was moving toward completion now, with or without our permission. Rebecca Thorne didn't look like a victim when we found her online. She looked chosen. Houston real estate developer, mid-30s, immaculate smile, the kind that belonged on billboards and conference stages. Her social media was full of vague, reverent language about destiny and transformation. Posts about land acquisition blurred into something almost devotional. She wrote about being honored, about finally being seen. Once you knew what to look for, the message was unmistakable. She had been buying property around Presidio quietly, paying cash, favoring parcels that bordered one another in rough arcs. When analysts overlaid her purchases on our maps, the shape matched the geometry from the journals with uncomfortable precision. Rebecca wasn't wandering into this. She was building toward it. Each signature, each transfer, another line drawn. When Foster tracked her movements, we saw the shift. Her posts became more frequent, more focused. She mentioned dreams of heat without pain, of standing in glass and feeling complete. In a private message she'd sent to a local contact, she wrote that June 12th would be the most important day of her life. She didn't ask if she would be safe. She asked if she would be remembered. Looking at her smiling photos, I understood something that made my skin crawl. Rebecca Thorne wasn't being hunted. She was walking willingly toward the center of the pattern, convinced that the desert had been waiting just for her. Maria Espinoza lived in a small adobe house at the edge of town, the kind that stayed cool no matter how cruel the sun became. She was 93 and sharp as broken glass. When I told her why I'd come, she didn't ask questions. She nodded, like she'd been waiting for the knock. Her family, she said, had been watching the desert since 1887, since the night an entire community disappeared and the land pretended it had always been empty. She called it El Devor, the hunger that walks, not a demon, not a god, something older that fed on attention and alignment. It slept beneath the desert, stretched thin across faults in the world we couldn't see. When the stars repeated themselves, when people remembered the wrong things at the right times. It stirred. Rituals didn't summon it. They focused it. Maria told me the glass was how it looked at us. That black surface wasn't stone or fire, but a wound held open. She said 9 willing souls were required not as payment, but as permission. 7 to weaken the barrier, 2 to hold it apart. She took my hand and warned me that once you interfered, you were never done. The hunger didn't forget resistance. It learned from it. Maria said the desert wasn't a place but a lid. Beneath it, something vast lay folded into itself, pressed thin by centuries of stone and forgetting. She described it as hunger, not for flesh, but for alignment, for moments when enough people believed, feared, or listened at the same time. That was when it could stretch, when it could reach the surface without fully waking. The ground here wasn't cursed, she said. It was exhausted. She told me the thing didn't move the way we understand movement. It seeped through gaps in time, through repetition and ritual, through stories passed down until they lost their endings. Every solstice, every massacre quietly erased from record, every disappearance that went uninvestigated made the barrier thinner. The desert absorbed those emissions and fed them downward. Maria warned me that the hunger didn't hate us. Hate required focus. This was older than emotion. It consumed because that was its shape. When people called it El Devor, they weren't naming it. They were describing a function. She said it watched through glass because glass remembered fire, and fire remembered change. Sitting there, listening to her voice tremble with certainty, I understood the most dangerous part wasn't that something slept beneath the desert. It was that it had learned exactly how to wake without ever fully opening its eyes. Maria was clear about one thing: the number mattered, not because of superstition, but because of balance. 9 willing souls weren't an offering. They were a mechanism. Each one chose a place in the pattern, whether they understood it or not. 7 weakened the boundary by standing where it was already thin. The 8th stabilized the opening, held it steady long enough for the last choice to matter. The 9th didn't open the door. The 9th made it stay open. She said willingness was the most important part. Fear could be worked around. Ignorance could be guided. But choice carried weight. A willing soul leaned into the fracture instead of away from it, adding its own intent to the strain. That was why the thing beneath the desert whispered instead of roared. It didn't need force. It needed agreement. Maria told me the original Watchers had learned this too late. They thought resistance meant refusal. In truth, resistance just changed the shape of the outcome. Interference marked you. It bound you closer, made you part of the equation whether you wanted to be or not. When I asked her what happened to those who stopped the ritual last time, she looked past me, out the window toward the open land, and said they never truly left. The desert kept them, just not in the way people remembered. Devil's Backbone opened up without warning, the land dropping away into a natural bowl that felt too deliberate to be chance, even before we saw the symbols. The air changed. Radios hummed. Headlights dimmed as if the dark were drinking them in. Then the ground began to glow. Lines burned softly across the stone, the same geometry I'd seen carved into glass and cave walls, now alive with a dull red light that pulsed in time with something beneath our feet. Figures in robes stood along the upper rim, faces hidden, unmoving. 13 of them, evenly spaced, forming a larger circle around a smaller one at the center. The desert wind passed through them without sound. At the heart of the amphitheater lay a disk of black glass, smaller than the first, but unmistakably the same. It reflected nothing, not even the firelight. It looked deeper than it should have been, like a hole punched through the night. Every instinct I had told me we were standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The symbols brightened as we approached, responding to our presence. I felt the pressure in my ears return, stronger now, paired with a sense of anticipation that wasn't mine. The amphitheater wasn't just a location. It was prepared, waiting, and we had arrived exactly when it expected us to. The glass at the center of the amphitheater began to ripple, not like liquid, but like a reflection disturbed by something moving behind it. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs, and every sound dulled as if wrapped in cloth. Bullets fired into the circle slowed, then stopped, hanging uselessly before dropping to the stone. The symbols flared brighter, casting warped shadows that bent in impossible directions. Something pushed back from the other side of the glass. Not a shape, an intrusion. Angles that refused to align with one another pressed forward, suggesting mass without form. My eyes slid away whenever I tried to focus, nausea blooming at the edges of my vision. The entity existed wrong, occupying more space than the circle allowed, bleeding into dimensions we didn't have names for. I felt it notice us, not individually, but as a cluster of attention. The glass grew warm, then hot. Hair lifted on my arms. The pressure in my skull intensified until I thought it might split. The robed figures didn't move. They didn't need to. The entity was emerging because it had been invited. Guided step by careful step across a boundary worn thin by centuries of repetition. Watching it press closer, I understood that we weren't witnessing an arrival. We were watching something remember how to reach us. Rebecca Thorne lay on the stone altar at the edge of the smaller circle, calm and radiant, eyes fixed on the writhing glass. She smiled as if she were finally where she belonged. When she raised the obsidian knife, the symbol surged with light, and the pressure became unbearable. Agents fired again out of instinct, rounds stopping short, falling harmlessly at our feet. The barrier shimmered, absolute and mocking. I didn't think. I ran. The moment I crossed the invisible line, the pain vanished, replaced by a cold clarity that sharpened everything. I slammed into Rebecca, knocking the knife from her hand as the glass screamed. The circle fractured, spiderweb cracks racing outward as if the ground itself were panicking. Agent Foster shouted orders I barely heard. Then the others fired. Not at the figures, but at the glass. It shattered. The light collapsed inward, symbols burning out as the pattern unraveled. The entity recoiled, a soundless convulsion tearing through the air, and the pressure snapped like a broken cable. Wind rushed in. The robed figures scattered, dissolving into shadow. Where the circle had been, there was only scorched stone and silence. I lay there gasping, knowing with grim certainty that we hadn't destroyed it. We'd interrupted it, and in doing so, we'd taught it something new. The official story was written before the dust settled. A drug cult, mass hallucinations, old murders dug up and arranged by unstable people chasing symbols they didn't understand. The reports were clean, confident, and airtight, the kind that discouraged follow-up questions. Evidence that didn't fit was mislabeled or quietly removed. Body cam footage glitched. Satellite images blurred at the wrong moments. By the time the press arrived, there was nothing left to see but scorched ground and men who looked tired. Agent Foster explained it to me without apology. She said the truth wouldn't bring justice, only panic. That most people couldn't live knowing how fragile the world really was. Lies, she said, were a form of containment, a way to keep the damage localized. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't find the words. I'd seen how easily belief could be shaped, how willingly people stepped into patterns they didn't recognize. The families of the dead were given answers that sounded reasonable enough to hurt. Martinez's disappearance was blamed on cult members fleeing the scene. No mention of glass, no mention of circles. Presidio County went back to pretending nothing had changed. But I knew better. Suppression didn't erase what happened. It just buried it shallow, where it could surface again when the ground shifted. Maria came to see me a week after the reports were finalized. She didn't waste time with condolences. She studied me the way a doctor studies an X-ray, searching for fractures you can't feel yet. She said the moment I crossed the barrier, the moment I broke the pattern with my own body, something had shifted. I hadn't walked away clean. None of the watchers ever did. She called it being marked. Not a wound, not a curse, but an attachment. By interrupting the ritual, I'd become an anchor point, a place where the hunger could press closest to the surface without fully emerging. I asked her if that meant it could reach me. She shook her head and said it already had. The entity didn't need permission anymore. It had recognition. The changes were subtle at first. Dreams that felt instructional. Heat that lingered on my skin long after I stepped into shade. A sense of anticipation that wasn't fear, but invitation. Maria gave me her great-grandmother's journal, thick with notes on resistance and delay. She warned me the mark would erode things slowly. Patience, empathy, sleep. The hunger didn't rush. It waited for you to meet it halfway. Convinced you were walking of your own free will. I knew the date before anyone told me. June 21st has a weight to it now, a pressure I feel days in advance, like the desert clearing its throat. On the solstice of 2023, they found me in my house just after dawn. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. I was seated at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly in front of me, surrounded by notebooks, filled edge to edge with writing that stopped mid-sentence. The deputies said I looked peaceful, that I was smiling. They didn't mention my eyes at first. Black glass filled the sockets perfectly, smooth and seamless, still faintly warm despite the cool morning air. No burns, no blood, just glass. Identical to the circles I'd spent years trying not to think about. The coroner ruled it a medical event complicated by stress. The report was signed and filed without delay. Carlos made sure of that. What the report didn't say was that several ranchers called it in the same week, sightings along the county line. A tall figure in a sheriff's uniform, walking the border fences at night, stopping to look out across the open land, always watching, always waiting. If this is where my part ends, understand this: the solstice is not an ending, it's a reminder. The desert still remembers, and it has learned my name, earned.